So, the Joseph story, uh, I promise I won't sing it. Um, uh, the story is well known, it's well loved, it's pretty straightforward. Though, having said that, a reminder that I've said also about a lot of other things we've read and talked about in these sessions. Outside of Genesis, outside of these chapters, no one else in the Bible seems to know this story. Right? The only reference to any part of the Joseph story, almost the whole thing, is in Psalm 105, which is itself just a retelling of the entire sort of narrative of Israel's early history in poetic form. Other than that, there's not a word about Joseph and his adventures in Egypt or pretty much anything else anywhere in the Bible. So, again, it's just a way of keeping a kind of frame around what we're talking about here. There's a lot of discussion out there about what kind of literature the Joseph story is, because it's not like the rest, right? Everything we've read to this point in Genesis has been, for the most part, episodic. Even the Jacob material, though it's a narrative cycle, as we discussed, it's still episodic in nature. That's not true of the Joseph story. It's a seemingly continuous narrative, each step building naturally on the next, with nice lessons learned at the end. And as a result, it's often referred to as a novella. It feels very different from the rest of Genesis. It's, in that way, much easier to write a musical about, as it turns out. While as I said, I don't want to spend too much time on it because I want to get to the questions, I do want to suggest that the Joseph story isn't really so different from what we've been reading. And so I want to take a few of the points I've made over the past weeks and apply them to this part of Genesis too. So you may recall in our discussion of Genesis 1, if you can recall that far back, that was probably in 2019 at some point, I pointed to the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story that has such strong parallels with the opening chapter of the Bible. Well, scholars like to point out that the account of Joseph and his master's wife in Genesis 39 seems to have a pretty good extra biblical parallel too. And this one, perhaps not surprisingly, comes from Egypt. And it's a text called The Tale of Two Brothers. It's a very pretty papyrus in the British Museum. This is a story that dates from the 12th century BCE, so well before the Joseph story was written. The details of the story aren't so important. The basic setup is there's two brothers, and the wife of one brother attempts to seduce the other brother. And when he rejects her, she tells her husband that he had tried to seduce her. Right? Where it goes after that actually is nothing at all like the Bible, but it is certainly possible that the biblical authors used a traditional Egyptian story here as part of their telling of the Joseph story. If you think about it, the function of that episode narratively is to get Joseph from his master's house into jail. That could have been done in a million different ways. That it happens to have been done this way with this parallel is pretty striking. If it's a coincidence, right, it's a hell of a coincidence. And as always with this sort of thing, it's useful to remember that the Bible wasn't first. And usually the Bible isn't particularly exceptional or different either. The Bible comes from ancient Israel, which was just one among many ancient Near Eastern cultures. Having said that, the Joseph story seems to contain a lot of knowledge about Egypt and Egyptian customs. The Egyptian names in the story, Potiphar, Zaphanat Paneach, Asenat, those are authentic Egyptian names. The Hebrew word that's used for Pharaoh's magicians, the ones who can't interpret Joseph's dreams, that's a Hebraization of an Egyptian word for a type of priest. The scene where Pharaoh places his gold ring on Joseph's hand and dresses him in robes and gives him a chain to wear around his neck, that seems to reflect authentic Egyptian practices of reward or appointment. The word that the Egyptians cry when Joseph parades before them, abrech, is good Egyptian for obey. Joseph tells his brothers that all shepherds are abhorrent to the Egyptians, which actually fits well with a pretty well attested Egyptian fear and hatred of sort of desert Bedouin types. According to the story, Joseph acquires all the land in Egypt for the king, except the land that belongs to the priests. This seems to reflect the true situation in Egypt, in which all land except that of the temples was subject to taxation. And of course, at the end of the story, Jacob is embalmed, which is a pretty Egyptian way of taking care of your dead. So there's quite a lot of elements in the story that seem to reflect an authentic Egyptian background. That doesn't mean, of course, that the story is any more true. It suggests, however, that the authors actually knew something of Egypt. That's not surprising. Egypt was a major power throughout Israelite history. Merchants and diplomats would have come through Israel, and Israelites in turn would have gone to Egypt. What's worth noting about it is that many of the parallels we have in the Joseph story with actual Egyptian custom seem to come not from the period of Egyptian history presumed in the Joseph story, which would be sometime in the 14th or 13th century BCE, but from quite a bit later in the first millennium. In other words, the biblical authors, the Israelite writers, are putting into the Joseph story Egyptian material from the time when they lived, not from when their story took place. They retrojected into the imagined past their contemporary knowledge of Egypt, which in the end is actually no more or less than we should expect. Right? They weren't doing they didn't have history books of Egypt to consult to see what customs were like before their time. Okay, so that's a little bit of the sort of extra biblical comparative stuff that we had talked about previously. I'm sure you'll recall our discussion of the flood story, where we saw that it wasn't really a unified, basically incomprehensible story originally, but it was two stories that had been woven together. Well, guess what? It may not be as obvious here, at least for big parts of it, but the Joseph story was put together in a similar manner. And the best place to see this is at the beginning of the story in Genesis 37. So let me ask you, people who read the story, how did Joseph get to Egypt? Well, let me tell you. Here's the key part of Genesis 37. So the brothers are sitting there eating a meal, Joseph having been tossed in a pit to die. And they look up and they see some Ishmaelites who are passing by on their way to Egypt. And Judah says, let's not kill him, let's sell him. And the brothers are like, yeah, good idea. And then, surprise, some Midianites come by and they take Joseph out of the pit. And then they who? The Midianites sell Joseph to the passing Ishmaelites. And the Ishmaelites bring Joseph to Egypt. And if that's not confusing enough, at the end of the chapter, we read that it was actually the Midianites who sold Joseph in Egypt. Right? It's just like the flood story. It's a problem of plot. I don't know what's happening. Who has Joseph? Who sold Joseph? Who brought Joseph to Egypt? It's incredibly unclear from this from this sort of central part of the chapter. Along with that, to my mind, pretty significant issue, there are smaller things in this chapter. How many reasons do the brothers need to hate Joseph, really? Because he's a tattletale? Because their father loved him more? How many times do they need to plan to kill him? How many brothers does it take to make a plan to save him? Reuben does it, then Judah does it. Anyway, turns out, surprise, surprise, there are actually two stories here. One, and I don't expect you to read all of this on the screen right now. One story, Joseph's brothers hate him for his dreams. They plan to kill him. But instead, they sell him to these passing Ishmaelites, and they play the trick on Jacob with the coat that they smear with the blood of the goat that they slaughter. That's one of the stories. And there's another story in which they hate him for being a tattletale, and they plan to kill him, though Reuben has other plans. But he's grabbed out of the pit by the Midianites and brought to Egypt, much to Reuben's dismay. He never had a chance to save him. As with the flood, the basic story outline is the same. Bad brothers, poor Joseph, off to Egypt. Whoops. Yep, there we go. But the details are quite different. And just as the two flood stories resonated with the two creation accounts, as you may recall from our discussion then, so too the two Joseph stories here about the sale of Joseph resonate with other parts of the Joseph story later on. Right? According to one version of the story, Joseph's brothers sold him to Ishmaelites. According to another version of the story, he was stolen out of the pit by the Midianites, and both of those claims will come back later at different points in the story. Both of them in Joseph's voice. So as with the flood story, we have basically trained ourselves culturally to read over these problems, right? We gloss over them. But a close reading of the text reminds us that the Bible and our sort of traditional tellings of it actually aren't identical. That's my brief discourse on the compositional history of the text. You may remember me speaking at the end of the session on Abraham about the two major Israelite origin stories, the patriarchs and the Exodus. The Joseph story, of course, is the material that links those two origin stories. It answers the big question. How did we go from a small family of our ancestors living already in the promised land, settling, building altars, burying their dead? How do we go from that to the entire nation of Israel, 600,000 strong, living in Egypt? It's not even 600,000, 600,000 men, 2 million people strong living in Egypt. And this is the answer. The Joseph story is the answer to that question. And the Joseph story is also the bridge between the two aspects of the patriarchal promise that we talked about, that is progeny and land. Most of Genesis, as we've seen, has been challenges to the promise of progeny. But now Jacob has become Israel. He's had his 12 sons. Progeny looks like we're doing okay. But in Genesis, they're all living in the land already. That hasn't been challenged much yet. So the Joseph story both closes off the issue of the progeny and opens the one of the land. Right? By the end of the Joseph story, Israel has been fruitful and multiplied. Right? That is, they fulfilled that part of the patriarchal promise. It's done. So, progeny, check. But now, just as the progeny is fulfilled, the land has been taken away from them. Or they've been taken away from the land, even better. So the Joseph story is the hinge in the entire Pentateuch. Right? The hinge between the patriarchal origin story and the Exodus origin story. But as I was saying last week, right, it's more than just an attempt at historical explanation. To get Jacob's family to Egypt and have them multiply there, right, which is what's required sort of by the two big story sequences, to get Jacob's family to Egypt and have them multiply there doesn't require all this, right? It doesn't require the full 15 chapters of the Joseph story. This isn't just an answer to a historical question. It's a story. It's characters. It's plot. It's literature. It's one of those fortunately, unfortunately tales, right? And the Joseph story, by the way it's told, is actually one of the easiest bits of Genesis to appreciate this way, sort of as narrative, as literature, because it's so continuous, because the characters do develop and grow. As I said, lessons are learned. At the same time, it is also doing the historical symbolism thing that we talked about. Our two main characters in the Joseph story are really Joseph and Judah. And Joseph, I love this map, This is a map of Israel's tribal territories. Joseph stands for the northern tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, right? Which you can see right in the middle there. Manasseh is a little bit bigger, Ephraim's a little bit smaller. Um, those are, of course, Joseph's two sons, right? And throughout the Bible, when people refer to Joseph, they're referring to Ephraim and Manasseh often. So Joseph stands for Ephraim and Manasseh. And you don't need to know a ton about the Bible to recognize in those territories some of the very major cities. You can see there Megiddo and Shechem and Shiloh and Bethel and Ai and Jericho that are right on the border there with Benjamin. So that's Joseph. And Judah stands for, well, like the gigantic southern tribe of Judah. These are historically the two power centers of Israel. Ephraim and Manasseh are the central heartland of Israel from its early inception. Judah, which for quite a long time was not particularly important, it's mostly sort of wilderness and desert down there. But Judah is where David comes from. And when Solomon dies and the nation of Israel splits in half, these are the two main sides. Right? The north centered around Ephraim and Manasseh, and the south of Judah. They're going to fight wars against each other, the north and the south of Israel. They're going to fight wars on the same side. So the story of Judah trying to kill and then save Joseph has somewhat more meaning in given the historical scenario that it's sort of representing. It's not quite as it was perhaps with Esau. It's not quite that we can map the relationships depicted in the Joseph story onto precise historical events. But as elsewhere, the relationships between the characters are reflections of relationships between larger entities in real life. And to add a little bit to that, the third major character in the story is Reuben, who unfortunately comes off as a bit of a sad sack of a character who can't quite ever do anything right. He fails to save Joseph in the beginning. Judah outdoes him later on in a second attempt to offer himself. And Reuben, which you can see from the map, is this little sort of stub of territory down in the southeast across the Dead Sea there. Reuben historically was a very unimportant tribe, even though by all traditions Reuben was the firstborn. So the story in which Reuben, the firstborn, sort of fails to sort of live up to his birthright or his birth order, again, is somewhat representative of the declined status of Reuben among the Israelite tribes in history. So again, it's literature. It's also history, in narrative form. The Joseph story, like most of Genesis, operates on multiple levels at once. I'll give you one more thing. I really want to save a lot of time for big picture questions. I think that's the fun part here at the end. The Joseph story is more than the rest of Genesis, clearly a tale with a lesson. It has a moral to it. And Joseph even says the lesson out loud. Though you intended me harm, God intended it for good. And actually, even earlier in the story, he says, it wasn't you who sent me here, it was God. The Joseph story, maybe certainly more explicitly than anywhere else in Genesis, has a clear sense of how God works in the world. And that is to say, behind the scenes, directing events, but silently. God basically doesn't intervene at all in this story. Doesn't appear to any characters except once to Jacob to tell him, don't worry about going down to Egypt. But he was going anyway, right? That's not really an intervention. It was just a message of relax a little. The Joseph story, there's no name changes. There's no promises. There's no divine interventions or anything. The most God does in this story is incline people to like Joseph a little more than they might normally. This is a particular theological stance. God will make things turn out for the best, which is very easy for Joseph to say from the position he's speaking from, right? He's come to Egypt, he's made it to the top, right? He's taken care of his family, right? God did all of this. It's all worked out for the best, Joseph says to his brothers. Easy for him to say, maybe a little harder for the Israelites a generation or two later to agree with Joseph there, that the descent into Egypt was all for the best.